Hello everyone. Today we are start orbit. It's a bone and opening for neurovascular structures. See this diagram. It's a frontal bone, sphenoid bone, zygomatic bone, and ethmoid bone, and this is lacrimal bone, and it's maxilla. See next B diagram. It's ethmoid bone, sphenoid bone, palatine bone, frontal bone, nasal bone, lacrimal bone, maxilla. Now see next diagram. Frontal bone, zygomatic bone, maxilla, sphenoid bone, laser wing, sphenoid bone, greater wing. See what a difference of all diagrams. A is anterior view. See, it's anterior view, and B it's lateral view, and C is medial view. See, so now we are talking about bone of the right orbit. So anterior view, lateral view, and medial view. The lateral orbit well has been removed in B, and the medial orbit well has been removed in C. The orbit is formed by 7 different bones indicated here by color shading. The frontal bone, zygomatic bone, maxilla, ethmoid bone, sphenoid bone, and also the lacrimal bone and palatine bone, which are visible only in the medial view. So we talk about the what present units deal with the bony anatomy of orbit themselves. The relationships of the orbit to each other are described in the next unit. See B. If we talk about B diagram, so openings in the orbit for neurovascular structures. Note the supraorbital foramen is an important site in routine clinical examination because the examiner process on the supraorbital dream with the thumb to the test sensory functions of the supraorbital nerves. The supraorbital nerves is a terminal branch of the first division of trigeminal nerve. So when pain is present in the distribution of the trigeminal nerve, tenderness to pressure may be noted at the supraorbital site. So if we talk about what is opening or passage and neurovascular structures, so optic canal is optic nerve, ophthalmic artery, and superior orbit fissure opening is structure about oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, ophthalmic nerve, lacrimal nerve, frontal nerve, nasociliary nerve, abducens nerve, superior ophthalmic nerve. And if we talk about inferior orbital fissure, see zygomatic nerve and inferior ophthalmic vein and infraorbital artery vein and nerve. If we talk about nasolacrimal canal, so its vascular structure is nasolacrimal duct. If we talk about infraorbital canal, so in this infraorbital artery, vein, and nerve. If we talk about supraorbital foramen, so in this supraorbital artery, supraorbital nerve, it's a lateral branch. And if we talk about frontal incisor, so it's a supratrochlear artery, supraorbital nerve, it's medial branch. If we talk about anterior ethmoidal foramen, so it's anterior ethmoidal artery, vein, and nerve. If we talk about posterior ethmoidal foramen, it's posterior ethmoid artery, vein, and nerve. So see in this diagram, supraorbital foramen, this frontal bone orbital part, zygomatic orbital foramen, and superior orbital fissure, this. And what is this? This is zygomatic bone. What is this? This is inferior orbital fissure. And what is this? This is infraorbital grooves. And what is this? Maxilloorbital surface. And what is this? It's a foramen. What? It's infraorbital foramen, because upper side supraorbital foramen present, so inside is infraorbital foramen present. See what is this? It's a frontal incisor. See this posterior ethmoidal foramen. See what is this? See it's anterior ethmoidal foramen. And what is this? This is optic canal, and it's maxilla frontal process, and it's lacrimal bone, and it's ethmoid bone orbital plate. See next diagram B. It's lacrimal bone, it's frontal bone orbital surface, it's anterior ethmoidal foramen, it's posterior ethmoidal foramen, it's ethmoid bone, it's optic canal, it's superior orbital fissure, it's foramen rotundum, and it's inferior orbital fissure, and it's in pterygopalatine fossa, and it's maxilla hiatus, it's maxillary sinus, and it's a foramen, infraorbital foramen. And what is this? This is the infraorbital canal, and it's maxilla orbital surface, and it's fossa of lacrimal sac with opening for nasolacrimal duct. What is this? This is anterior lacrimal crest, it's part of maxilla, and it's posterior lacrimal crest, lacrimal bone, it's maxilla frontal process. Now see next diagram, it's a C diagram, it's a medial view. See here frontal sinus, here frontal bone orbital surface, here superior orbital fissure, this is a sphenoid bone laser wing, this is sphenoid bone greater wing, and this is maxillary sinus, and this is palatine bone pyramidal process, and this is inferior orbital fissure, and this is infraorbital canal, and this is maxilla orbital surface, and this is zygomatic orbital foramen, and this is zygomatic bone orbital surface. If we talk about all diagram, so A is part is anterior view, lateral view, and B is lateral view, and C is medial view. The lateral orbital valve has been removed in B, the medial orbital wall in C. The following opening for the passage of the neurovascular structures so can be identified: the superior and inferior orbital fissures AC, the optical canal is AB, the anterior and posterior ethmoidal foramen BC, and infraorbital grooves, the infraorbital canal and the infraorbital foramen AB. Diagram B show the orifice of the nasolacrimal duct by which lacrimal fluid is conveyed to the inferior meatus of the nose. The lacrimal view B is demonstrated the funnel-like structure of the orbit, which functions like socket to contain the eyeball and constrain its movements. The inferior orbit fissures open into the pterygopalatine fossa, which border on the posterior wall of the maxillary sinus. It contains the pterygopalatine ganglia. It important component of the parasympathetic nervous system. The upper part of the exposed maxillary sinus bear the ostium in the maxillary hiatus, by which the sinus open into the nasal cavity superior to the inferior concha. See if we talk about orbit and neighboring structures, so in these structures, frontal sinus here, ethmoid bone, anterior cranial fossa, and its frontal bone, it's a sphenoid bone of lesser wing, it's a greater wing of sphenoid bone, and it's zygomatic bone, it's maxillary sinus, and it's vomer, and it's inferior nasal concha, and it's superior orbital fissure to middle cranial fossa, and it's ethmoid bone cell, and it's bone temporal bone, and it's parietal bone. So this diagram, the color coding here is the same as for the bone of the orbit on page 14-15. These bones also form portion of the wall of neighboring cavities. The following adjacent structures are visible in the diagram: anterior cranial fossa, frontal sinus, middle cranial fossa, and ethmoid cells as maxillary sinus. Disease process may originated in the orbit and spread to these cavities, or originating these cavities and spread to the orbit. The Terminologia Anatomica has dropped the term ethmoideus sinus in favor of ethmoid cell. If we talk about this table, in this table, clinically important relationships between the orbit and surrounding structures. So relationships to the orbit: inferior, superior, and middle. Inferior is neighboring structure is maxillary sinus, and superior neighboring structure is frontal sinus. Anterior cranial fossa contain the frontal lobes of the brain, and medial is neighboring structure is ethmoid cell. And it's if we talk about a deeper structure that have a clinically important relationships to the orbit, so it include sphenoid sinus, middle cranial fossa, optic chiasm, pituitary, cavernous sinus, pterygopalatine fossa. So see this diagram. In this diagram, this is ethmoid bone, perpendicular plate, and this is frontal sinus, it's crista galli, it's ethmoid bone, and it's superior orbital fissure, it's superior nasal concha, it's inferior orbital fissure, and it's orbital floor, and it's middle nasal concha, and its inferior nasal concha, and this is frontal bone of orbital surface, and it's sphenoid bone laser wing, and it's optic canal, and it's ethmoid bone orbit plate, lamina piperisha, orbital surface greater wing, zygomatic bone orbital surface, infra orbit canal, maxillary sinus, and its vomer, and its palatine process of maxilla. So we talk about this diagram. This diagram is about orbits and neighboring structures. Coronal sections through both orbits view from the frontal. The wall separating the orbit from the ethmoid cell, 0.3 mm lamina piperaceae, and from the maxillary sinus, 0.5 mm orbital floor are very thin. These both of these walls are susceptible to fractures and provide routes for the spread of tumor and inflammatory process into the out of the orbit, and the superior orbital fissures communicates with the middle cranial fossa. And so several structures that are not pictured here, the sphenoid sinus, pituitary gland, optic chiasm, are also closely related to the orbit. If we see this diagram, in this diagram is a frontal bone zygomatic process, ethmoid bone, and its sphenopalatine foramen, and its pterygopalatine fossa, and its sphenosquamous suture, and its temporal bonosquamous part, and its greater wing of temporal surface, and it's a zygomatic bone, and it's maxillary tuberosity, and it's pterygoid humulus, and it's pterygoid process lateral plate. In this diagram, close up view of left pterygopalatine fossa, the lateral view. The pterygopalatine fossa is a crossroads between the middle cranial fossa orbit and nose, being traversed by many nerves and vessels that supply these structures. The pterygopalatine fossa is continuous laterally with the infratemporal fossa. This diagram shows the lateral approach to the pterygopalatine fossa through the infratemporal fossa, which is utilized in surgical operations on tumor in these regions. Example, nasopharyngeal fibroma. If we talk about this diagram, so it's inferior orbital fissure, and its temporal surface, its infratemporal crest, and its pterygoid process lateral plate, and its foramen spinosum, its foramen oval, and its pterygoid process middle plate, and its coena, and its palatine bone pyramidal process. If we talk about this diagram, so its inferior view, the arrow indicates the approach to the pterygopalatine fossa from the skull base. The fossa itself not visible in this view. It is lateral to the lateral plate of the pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone. If we talk about this diagram, see in this diagram, inferior fissure orbit and foramen rotundum, and here sphenopalatine foramen, and its greater palatine canal, and its pterygopalatine fossa here present, and here pterygoid canal. So connections of the left pterygopalatine fossa with the adjacent structures. So the content of the pterygoid palatine fossa include the pterygopalatine ganglion, which is an important ganglion in the parasympathetic nervous system. If we talk about this table, in this table, the structure bordering the pterygopalatine fossa direction and bordering structures. The anterior is bordering is maxillary tuberosity, posterior is pterygoid process, and medial is perpendicular plate of palatine bone, and lateral is infratemporal fossa via the pterygomaxillary fissure, and superior is greater wing of the sphenoid bone junction with the inferior orbital fissure, and its inferior, its structure is retropharyngeal space. If we talk about this diagram, in this diagram we are talk about pathway to the pterygopalatine fossa. So pathway from and transmitted structures. So pathway is foramen rotundum, it's from middle cranial fossa, and transmitted structure is maxillary nerve. Pterygoid canal pathway is pterygoid canal called is Vidian canal, and its pathway it's from skull base inferior surface, and transmitted structure is greater petrosal nerve, parasympathetic branch of facial nerve, deep petrosal nerves, parasympathetic fiber from the carotid plexus, and artery of the pterygoid canal with the accompanying veins, nerve of pterygoid canal. If we talk about greater palatine canal, so it's from palate, and it's transmitted structure is greater palatine nerve, descending palatine artery, greater palatine artery, and next is talk about lesser palatine canal. It's from plate, and its structure is laser palatine nerve, laser palatine arteries, and terminal branch of the descending palatine artery. It's Next is sphenopalatine foramen. It's from nasal cavity, and structure is sphenopalatine artery plus accompanying vein. And next point is lateral and medial superior posterior nasal branches of the nasopalatine nerve. Next is inferior orbital fissure from orbit. So it's infraorbital nerves, zygomatic nerve, orbital branch, orbital artery, accompanying vein, inferior ophthalmic vein. It's whole structure of inferior orbital fissure. So we are talk about nose, but in next class. Thank you.